being able to speak autonomously. And it's a very kind of precarious terrain. Because still like it is not in a sense like the local that holds the means of representation in a sense. And if we say like, if we just replace means of representation with means of production, we know how the means of production in the contemporary art world are spread, distributed, positioned, etc., etc. So like a lot of these artists and curators struggle with how to not to be invisible, but yet to be able to act as autonomous subjects in a sense that they are not interpolated by the international curatorial demand for specific types of artworks, content, or packaged identities. Like a curator calls this like ethnic marketing, etc., etc. Yes, Nerd?
I understand what you're saying. I understand the urgency. I feel, though, that since you've put this in a modernist genealogy, even though you're trying to distinguish the Egyptian events, you've still created this historical framework that takes us back to the commune and the problems of the commune, that takes us back to 1968 and the problems of 68, that really resonates with the same kind of stakes of the event and how to represent the event. And so not only Manet, but Courbet, not only, and so I think there's a kind of problematic here in terms of sketching out this genealogy, which I understand why you are kind of keen to do it, but that still then falls into this binary. And and perhaps in order to distinguish what it is that you are talking about in terms of the event today, there needs to be a third form that you're still trying to sketch out, whatever that is, and it's not there yet. And I'd love to see it happen, but at the moment I still see this binary form content. I still see a struggle with modernism that doesn't take into account the debates of the commune, if you're putting it that way, and the kind of the avant-garde debate of a kind of Western avant-gardism. And so there are a lot of points there that I would love for you to speak about. And I understand the imperative, but I feel that the blind spots are still very much kind of actively lurking. And so what are these third terms, more precisely?
Yeah, it is a very problematic project, as I mentioned, in the sense that also, like, if we are working through Adorno today, can we do that? Because for Adorno, this autonomy of the artwork was very much secured by medium specificity, by the physical support. So what is the support of the artwork today? And I don't want to go into like Rosalind Krauss's argument of medium specificity, etc., because it has its own problems. But I'm also thinking of like various recent theories of the avant-garde, especially that of John Roberts, if we remember, who actually combines the Adornian notion of autonomy with that of the Hegelian by Zizek's notion of the subject, the asocial desire of the subject that can never be, like a kind of excess within the subject that can never be socialized. And what John Roberts argues is that it's that a social excess that is embedded in the very constitution of the subject that provides a possibility for autonomy. So in a way, it's a kind of like a non-formalist articulation of formalism, if we can say, holding on to some of the enlightenment possibilities, or possibilities of not enlightenment, but he's much more hopeful than some of the recent theories of the avant-garde, in a sense, John Roberts. But what I wanted to go back is there are lots of gaps, and like methodologically, I would rather hold on to the binaries at the moment before I find a way to suspend them. Unless like I have very a very strong argument for suspension, then, kind of getting rid of the binaries could result in like glossing over them. So, and I don't want to gloss over the binaries because they are there. I mean, not simply in the specific context, but also in the sort of dilemmas that we face. And I wanted to kind of like hold on to them, as I said before, I could find the theoretical like leap towards their suspension or towards their deconstruction. But yeah, it's a very, as I said, it's a very sketchy and raw project.
A lot of what you're talking about reminds me of a conversation I had recently, because a lot of funding is granted vis-a-vis certain political agendas, re-invoking the public within the art project itself for artists and for curators. And this is, for me, a problem because it's creating a false artificial, it's a false political space of both artistic performativity and then the perceived spectatorship, right? So when you have, there's a lot of projects right now that people are doing that tries to involve the community, and it's all about community involvement, and they get funding because of that community involvement, which creates then this fictive narrative of the community that's really participating when it's just as false. I mean, what is your take on that? Because this is, to me, part of the dilemma that you're discussing here.
Yeah, I mean, there is a kind of like, in this, this kind of funding is a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, like, it allows some institutions that otherwise exist in a very precarious situation to be able to sustain themselves. But on the other hand, it's a very patronizing attitude, of course, towards the community and towards the artists who work in specific contexts. But maybe like Atam could share like some of these examples of community projects and fundings directed towards this project. But just like from my personal experience, like exactly right after like 2011 resignation of Mubarak, I guess now it's such a deep past, it seems. I was flooded with like multiple emails like from various art institutions. Would you participate in an art and revolution panel? Would you recommend Egyptian artists who work on revolutionary themes? Would you do this and that? And like, ultimately we stopped answering to this sort of like demands. I would just send a title of an artwork that Hassan Khan did sometime in the late 90s. It was called Read Fanon, You Fucking Bastards. And that would be like the quote that I would send. But yes, also like recently, there's those European foundations, when they want to nominate, in their outreach programs, like Middle Eastern artists, they always send like this kind of criteria. Could you nominate someone who is like known for community activism and community outreach? So yeah, there is a very specific kind of like expectation for producing false discourse in a sense.
I like that. A lot with the street theater in Central America, for instance, and all these projects, but they have a continuity. And a lot of the art funding then goes into a one-off project, and communities, the UK is known for this. They put all this money into something, then the new regime comes in, and all that money is forgotten for that project and goes to something completely else. So you have a lot of half-started projects, or projects that sort of did something and then quickly stopped. And so I'm not trying to discount the value, obviously, of social praxis and art. I'm coming from that myself. But I guess when you start to put these various subjects, I'll give you, one example is that in, where is it? There is a reality TV show that's been proposed to send, to have reality TV within an IDP camp in Italy. This was a program, I think, for RAI. This was like, there's a petition being sent around. I just found out about it literally 10 days ago. And this has caused great concern because, of course, they view it as humanitarian, but you're putting up people in the most dire situations to tap dance for the public. So those kinds of even human rights ethics might be part of it, on top of very much the form-content dilemma, because then you have one being driven by the other in a very artificial way. Meanwhile, you know, art and the community has always been there, even before it was formalized as a practice.
Yeah, and I think there's an example of like Splendid Mousserine in Egypt that documents like and empowers people who have been subjected to military violence to document and to speak about their experiences. And it's a group of activists, and they've done some like really kind of radical projects, including broadcasting military atrocities in a sense on the television building Maspero. But I mean, this is wonderful and this is great, and I really admire their work. But the problem is when, let's say, they are represented in the Berlin Biennial, you know, as an artist collective. And of course, they know of these dilemmas, and they are also very well aware. And how easy it is to be suddenly like packaged as that artist activist type that you are expected to speak for the context.
Andrea Fraser makes the same claim when she's talking about institutional critique, right? And she's looking for a way to maintain autonomy as a service provider. So I'm just thinking, what is it specifically about the event that you're reacting to, the event circa insert a year, that's different from some of these other genealogical imperatives that you're trying to locate this larger situation?
I guess it's like more of a, I mean, the channels of dissemination of the event are much faster, they are simultaneous, they are broader, like in a geographic sense. The media industry is much more global right now than it used to be. And of course, like the demand for content comes from that globalized network of like, in a sense, like information economy that wasn't necessarily the case in '68, but also, I mean, it has very kind of like geopolitical grounding in the interest in the Middle East, and the very specific like ways of like how politically the Middle East has been constructed in the past 20 years. You know, that, I mean, that makes the event much more different than like the 1968 as an event. I mean, I need time to kind of develop and
I understand, but I think the forms that you're showing then are very related. Because on the one hand, you're calling for this radical event, on the other hand, you're kind of still showing us in nostalgic forms in many ways. So what are the forms today that are structurally answering these conditions, that are not nostalgic or belated or somehow reactionary or reactive to that speed, globality, interaction, dissemination?
I don't find these forms terribly nostalgic in the sense that, or reactionary for that matter. I mean, they're not trying to kind of return to some sort of like a past, but how in a way that they're trying to articulate on a formal level how the certain past has reverberations in the present. Like, for example, in Hassan's work, it has to do with the construction of like the Egyptian middle class identity through very specific forms and artifacts that one encounters, but also the disappearance of that class, or its dissipation within like a more, in a sense, stratified or like more complex social and class relations, and there are different forms of identification that you have today. But it's not like a nostalgic mourning, you know, to go back to those kind of class constitutions and the forms that shape, but more like a, in a sense, like an archaeology of current class conditions and what happened to. So I don't find them terribly nostalgic.
I think I add to what you are saying. I I found very interesting in your comments and what you are saying, and I will actually go into this line because I think that here is not the question, how I understood your question, but I thought it's really important. It's a question about authorization in a certain way. Why this piece of wood that we see on this image actually has the status of art, and in which period is done, and why, what is this authorization that in that moment, in the 70s, these things are actually not questioned. Who can actually come inside the museum galleries, present such a work and be, so to say, seen as the symbol of a certain evacuation, as you said, of form of content? Because I think that the content is precisely hidden. It's there very much. It's the content of the whole institution of contemporary art at that historical moment. And why, for example, if today somebody will come, I don't know, from a certain part of Azerbaijan, if they have a wood, and bring some part of such piece of wood, put in the museum or at the Venice Biennale, how this will be actually seen. What will be the status of this work? If this work will not be seen, oh my God, it's a content brought because of this and that. And I think this question, the question of what actually decides what is content and what is form, historically, I think it's one of the most important question or point that is actually not, so to say, put as a point, but we work with content and form as givens. Like we know what they are, and now we say this is. But are we knowing what is? Why this is not a content? For me, this piece of wood is actually a pure content. A content of the position. Who can come in the museum in the 70s? What means arte povera? Who actually is talking about arte povera? So all these questions.
Of course, I mean, it's, you know, the structures of legitimization, the structures of authorship, of constitution of art as institution, of politics of inclusion and exclusion, of institutional critique, they're all very valid, and they have. We should never forget about those questions that have been asked since the 60s and 70s. And I'm not saying let's get rid of them, but in a way, as I was saying, I wanted to, in a way, like to strategically suspend them for a moment, because, you know, it's, I mean, we all like to talk about who gets in, who is left out, who legitimizes what, and again, as I'm saying, it's all very valid, but I wanted to spend this in a moment and see whether there is an artwork. I mean, I'm saying something very problematic and provocative. If there is an artwork without this, or outside, or outside of all this, like institutional and economic and, you know, power politics that surrounds the constitution of the artwork. This is a question that I was asking, maybe like a kind of an ontological question in a sense. I'm not saying that, like, you know, Pannone's piece is like ontologically art and it's there. But all I'm saying is that is there something in the artwork that is irreducible? Maybe some small excess, maybe something that is not reducible to all this institutional politics and the violence of inclusion and exclusion and legitimization that we all are very well aware of.
But why? Sorry, just because it's really very interesting. But then why we didn't take somebody from the street instead of you there? Because here it's actually a question of authorization. In a certain way, you can pose this question because you have a certain history of authorization, as I am inviting. I'm sure if I will be a cook in a big hotel, you will not invite me to speak about contemporary art. Because this will be not,
I guess it is.
So I just want to say that I found it important, these questions of how we structure these points of departure, how we actually, in one way, what is in the air.
Yes, I'm not disagreeing with you. I mean, yeah, I'm sitting here and talking from here, right? showing the slides like very kind of like compiled from institutionalized art discourses. Of course, it's all there.
Angela, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. Just a small observation. I think it's really, I mean, the question you pose is the problem is within the terminology, with this binary opposition of form and content, because within the modernist dialectic, form is content and content is form. I think, I mean, you know, in the way you have described and explained what you mean by content, it's more message as opposed to content, and form is more of the autonomous power of the artwork, as Boris would describe it. You know, I think maybe if the terminology was a bit different, you know, we wouldn't have these issues.
Yeah, in a way, like, I think I want to insist on that binary, as I said. And I mean, as I mentioned, like by form, I mean, I'm kind of using the Adornian formulation that form is not again morphology, that is simply like shapes, you know. It's content that over time has crystallized in some sort of like a presence, if I can call it a presence, because we are not talking about the physicality of the medium anymore. It has crystallized in a form of presence that refers to the social conditions, that comes out of the conditions in which it is produced, but no longer easily feeds back to them. You know, like being a product of the social world and a specific social technique. And I mean, today we talk about autonomy, it's socially conditioned, right, as well. It's socially determined. But emerging outside, or like taking resources from that world, it does not explain that world. So I guess, like, in a way, like if I put it in very simple words, it's like against constant explication and commentary that is expected from it. Yeah. Maybe we can have a discussion also during the seminars and move on to the
It
workshop.
sounds like, if you don't mind me, I know you're trying to wrap this up. It sounds like you're talking about singularities and immanence.
Yeah.
And you're talking about form as a singularity within a plane of immanence. But what it sounds like is an ontological, essential, not essential, but an attempt at an ontological specificity. And what the crowd, I think, is saying is, what about the field of the exterior, right? How can these be singular iterations of fields of power? And I think this idea of immanence that you're trying to get to can be fleshed out in a way that's more, I know you're trying to hold on to these binaries for some reason, but there is a sense in which immanence can be argued a different way that might be more productive in order to get out of this ontological cul-de-sac.
I think you're right. He says that he's unless like we really historicize, you know. And something that I did.
And why Manet and Courbet? For example, why not Manet Courbet? There's already a dialectic in place in that history of modernism, if you're going to go there.
Yeah.
But I think it's the
Oh, it's very valuable.
worth pursuing. Worth pursuing.
Yeah, I've made it.
Was there a moment that you can think of the 20th century though when this wasn't the double bind of form and content might have been more released? I mean, I'm thinking of the Dadaists and their, you know, or even the walks of Robert Smithson or something that sort of take that intertwined nature of form and content out of itself.
Yeah, and I mean, as I mentioned, I mean, I prefer to like, if it wasn't so problematic, to like try to see if it's possible to work with Benjamin's categories, right? I mentioned the notion of technique that does not going to the library of form and content. And of course, like also that very kind of revolutionary moment when the aesthetic avant-garde and the political avant-garde were rubbing shoulders very closely. Like the work of like also Russian constructivists, for example. But yes, it's also like a singular historical moment. And then if we are discussing like this kind of dialectic between the political avant-garde and the aesthetic avant-garde, then it's a very kind of rocky terrain throughout the 20th century. And I think that if you're talking about moments, that moment of convergence in the early 1920s Russia was quite special in this sense.
In Benjamin, those techniques are techniques of the self that also have to do with the space of reception.
And so I think the space of reception here, the field of the exterior, in relationship to the event that you're describing, in relationship to these vectors, to these lines of flight, however you want to call them, it needs to be opened up, I think, a little bit more in order not to fall into a technique that doesn't include that field of reception. Anyway.
We wrap up? Let's wrap up until